have some introspection and conversation about what we're going to do different going forward.
Rank and vile. Miami Beach Police Chief unloads about officers' racist and pornographic emails and his mission to change the culture from the top.
Mr. Curbelo goes to Washington and makes some moves. The freshman Miami congressman is here live to talk about them.
A perfectly awful week for Jeb Bush and a very good one for Marco Rubio as he outlines what his foreign policy would look like. We will take it to the roundtable.
And it's a good one. Good morning. So great to be with you. As always, the big local story this week involved high-ranking police officers transmitting porn and racist jokes as internal emails.
And this time it is the Miami Beach Police Department, and those involved include a former major allowed to retire and a lieutenant who was fired this week. The state attorney and Miami Beach police chief who took the helm last year blame a good old boy culture that was built up during the prior administrations.
We have wonderful people here doing great police work. I'm proud to be the police chief here and to be associated with all these wonderful people, and I'm feeling their anguish that once again they are being tarred by the behavior of a handful of people, and to have it be people who are at the top of the organization is just it's exasperating and frustrating.
Just a small part of Dan Oates' first sit-down interview since taking the helm of the Miami Beach Police Department. Chief Oates talks about this latest scandal and also his mission to change the culture and perception of that department. And you will hear the conversation in just a few minutes.
And we look forward to that. But first, we're going to speak with the newest member of Congress from South Florida, Carlos Curbelo. He was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives last November to represent the 26th Congressional District. That is a big swath of southwest Miami-Dade, all of Monroe County, and much of Collier County, too. Mr. Curbelo previously served on the Miami-Dade County School Board. Congressman, great to have you come in.
Welcome.
Glenna, Michael, good morning.
Your
it's good to be with you.
first time since you were elected here?
First time.
When you, Carlos, when you were running for office, a major part of your theme was your dissatisfaction with dysfunction in Washington, how little respect Congress got, and you said, when I get there, I am going to work hard as I can without violating my core principles to reach across the aisle, work with Democrats. Have you been able to do that?
I have, Michael, and things in Congress are getting better. We still have a long way to go. Congressional approval is up 5 points from 14 to 19. We got to celebrate the small victories. And there is a lot more reaching across the aisle than we've seen in the previous 2 Congresses. I, for example, have a bipartisan lunch group with David Jolly, a Republican from Tampa, and Gwen Graham and Patrick Murphy. We get together every month, talk about issues.
Those are Democratic Congress members.
Exactly,
yeah.
And we're starting to put legislation together and to introduce legislation together. So, look, our country was built through compromise. The Constitution is the product of compromise. So now it's our turn to practice compromise and to move the nation's agenda forward.
You know, this week I think you surprised a lot of people by coming out and saying what Jeb Bush, Marco Rubio has not said. Climate change is real. I think you had mentioned that it should not be a partisan issue, and that's something that I think a lot of people stood up and said, wow, maybe this is going to be the Republican leadership on this issue. What's been the reaction to that in the party?
I just don't know how anyone from South Florida can propose that we just ignore this issue. We have the Everglades right next door. As a matter of fact, we live in the Everglades, technically, and that's where we get our drinking supply from. So for those who don't believe we have a moral obligation to Everglades restoration and to the environment, well, they should take the pragmatic position that we really need a healthy Everglades and a healthy environment for our own livelihood. So what I'm challenging people in my party is to recognize the reality that is climate change. Humans do have an impact, and rather than fighting on whose fault it is, let's start preparing for climate change, right? Rising sea levels, it's happening. Let's invest in the infrastructure we need to prepare for that, and let's also do everything we can without crushing our economy to prevent human influence on the environment.
What's been the reaction, though, to that from your party?
In Congress.
And your flight with the president on Earth Day, you were on Air Force One, you arrived with the president. What feedback are you getting on that?
Most people have been very respectful of my position. I think a lot of people understand this. They don't want to speak about it openly because they fear political repercussions, but I think we need a little more courage in politics on both sides of the aisle. And there are issues where the Democrats are reticent to being honest and sincere and forthcoming, and they deserve to be criticized for that too. But this issue of the environment, I mean, it matters, and those of us in South Florida know it better than anyone else. And to be fair, Everglades restoration has always been a bipartisan issue.
Yeah.
It was kicked off by Jeb Bush and Bill Clinton. So I really think that we're going to make a lot of progress. For example, the president's line item on Everglades restoration, the U.S. House of Representatives has fully funded it. So I think we're on a good
and
path.
on Air Force One, April 22nd, when you were invited to come down with the president and some other members of Congress, what did you talk? You talked about this very subject, I take it.
We talked a lot about the environment. On Air Force One, we were with Bill Nye, the science guy. It was the president, Bill Nye. I was sitting in front of the president, and Patrick Murphy was next to me. It was a four-person
Congressman
table.
from West Palm Beach.
That's right. And then when we got to Miami, I boarded Marine One with the president, and Pedro Ramos, the superintendent of Everglades National Park, was there, and he spoke extensively about the Everglades, about the environment. And I told the president, I said, look, we disagree on many issues, but here's an issue where I think we can work together. By the way, Cuba also came up during the Marine One ride, and there we did have some sharp disagreements.
All right,
Well,
so
that's the next question.
All right, that is the next question. All right, so the president obviously is moving forward at a fairly fast speed, relatively speaking, to normalize relations. What did you tell him?
Well, look, I put the president's actions with regards to Cuba in the context of his broader foreign policy. And we know he's at the table with Iran. We know that many of our allies across the world feel undermined by the President of the United States. So his policy with regards to Cuba was not surprising to me. I just think it's a mistake. And I told the President, I said, look, I think you've given away all our leverage in exchange for very little. Remember, all of this has been done in the context of the liberation of Alan Gross. So for holding an American hostage for 5 years unjustly, the Cuban government has essentially gotten all of the concessions that they ever wanted and then some. So I let the president know, and you know, he pushed back, and it was a lively exchange.
Although the president frames the changes in the context of, we've had a half century of policy that has not worked, let's try something else.
And that's exactly what he told me. And I said, Mr. President, if your standard for the policy or the goal is regime change, and that's the only goal, you're right, it hasn't worked. But I don't think anyone is naive enough to think that our policy alone was going to topple the Castro government when Cuba trades and receives support from the rest of the world. I told the president another important goal of our sanctions policy with regards to Cuba is to deny the Castro dictatorship the funds, the cash that it needs in order to be a world player. This is a government, Glenna, remember, during the Soviet subsidies, when they were cash rich, they had their military deployed throughout the world. They were aggressively exporting revolution. Thanks to our sanctions policy, their military was crippled after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and now, at the very least, they can't do us as much harm as they used to.
Well, it's crippled. Their economy is crippled also because they're incompetent managers,
Right.
and they have a state-controlled economy. It's not a capitalist open economy. Well, on May 29th, Congressman, as we all know, Cuba's going to come off the U.S. State Department list of state sponsors of terrorism. And then, according to Raul Castro this past week, you know, he says, then I'll be able to appoint an ambassador. We can move forward on embassies. Is this just so far down the road that it can't be stopped?
Well, it's very clear that Raul Castro, as a condition for normalizing sanctions, requested to be removed from the list of state sponsors of terror, which is not the way it should work. We should actually study whether or not Cuba is sponsoring terrorist organizations.
You actually called it reckless.
It is reckless because we know that Cuba still has very close relations with the FARC in Colombia, who continue killing and taking people hostage. We know that Cuba continues harboring some Basque terrorists. We know that some people on the FBI's most wanted list live in Cuba with impunity. So, yeah, I thought it was reckless. And, Michael, to your question, there's some things we'll be able to do in Congress to perhaps put the brakes on some of this. Yeah. And remember, the most significant sanctions are still codified, so they cannot be lifted without Congress.
The embargo, which is in many ways the legacy of former Congressman Lincoln Diaz-Balart, was the leader on that. You know, before we run out of time here, I have to ask you, on Monday night, Jeb Bush is going to have a rally in West Miami-Dade at the Jorge Mascanosa Center. It's being sponsored by Ileana Ros-Lehtinen, Mario Diaz-Balart, Lincoln Diaz-Balart. Are you going to be there?
I'm not going to be there, Michael. First of all, we have votes. Secondly, I have said that I won't be endorsing any candidate unless they are an officially declared candidate. So I'm watching this. I have two neighbors running for president, Jeb Bush and Marco Rubio. I think they would both make wonderful presidents, but I am not yet ready to make a decision. I do think executive leadership is very important. When I look at the White House today and the occupant, President Obama lacked executive leadership experience. I think that has shown throughout the years, so that is a factor I will certainly consider, but I am not ready to endorse any candidate for president.
What's been the biggest change from making policy on a school board to making policy for the country?
Well, on the school board, I was one of 9. Now I'm one of 435. So that right there is a major change. You have to dedicate so much time to getting to know your colleagues, to building relationships, because without those relationships, you're not going to get anywhere in Washington, D.C. And that means relationships on both sides of the aisle. Obviously, leadership is important, but sometimes if you can get some support from Democrats on some issues, it really helps advance your cause. So I've been working on issues what we would call in football blocking and tackling, so issues that would help English language learners in our schools in Miami-Dade County. With Congressman Murphy, I represented a Foreign Spill Protection Act, which would hold foreign oil companies to the same cleanup standards as American oil companies. And then more broadly, I've been working on...
Was that aimed at Cuba by chance?
Cuba, the Bahamas. The Bahamas are also drilling there, and it really has an impact on the entire country.
Yes.
We think Mexico is going to expand their drilling operations soon. And right now, a foreign oil company is only liable for the first $150 million in cleanup costs, whereas U.S. oil companies are responsible, as we saw in the Gulf, for the full cost, which was about $14 billion.
Yeah, you're talking about the nitty-gritty work of a member of Congress, and
like that.
We're glad to hear about it and glad you're up there working hard. And in the future, we will have you back, I'm sure, many times. Carlos Curbelo, great to have you come in this morning.
Thanks so much.
Anytime. Happy
Thank
to
you.
be here.
All right, when we come back, police, porn, racism, and the push to change the culture at the Miami Beach Police Department. Chief Dan Oates is next. Miami Beach, as I'm sure you know, has had some serious problems with its police department in recent years, problems that seem to have come to an end with the appointment of a new chief, Dan Oates. But there was a new scandal this week. News that 2 high-ranking Miami Beach cops and more than a dozen others had exchanged hundreds of racist and pornographic emails.
The department's chief of less than a year talks about how he discovered it, his mission to fix the dysfunction and the perception of the department, in his first sit-down interview with us this week.
I literally went over to the Internal Affairs Office and looked at some of the pornography that they had discovered in emails, and I knew that we had a very serious problem, and it was completely obvious that it hadn't been properly addressed. And at the time that I ordered the investigation, I thought it was a pornography case, and the point of the investigation was who received the emails, who was sending the emails, what did they do with it, because it was some pretty disgusting stuff and wildly inappropriate in the workplace and wildly violative of city and police department rules. And so that's how this started, is 2 young captains telling the new chief, there is this lingering matter that was not properly addressed. We know you want to know about it, and we know that you'll do something about it.
So is it your sense that you were brought in as chief to this department, really the first new chief in, as long as I can remember, in this city that is not from within the department? Is it your sense that you are an outside hire for a very specific reason?
I think that's fairly obvious by what occurred. And again, this is the 3rd department I've taken over. And in each case, the community and the elected officials were seeking an outsider because they wanted a fresh look at the organization.
Do you find anything glaringly different than any other department that you've worked in?
Well, this is my 4th police department, and they're all very different departments, different areas of the country. I worked a 21-year career for the largest police department in the United States, the NYPD, during a really dynamic and exciting time of turnaround and change. I worked for 4 years in a major college town, Ann Arbor, with a major university. in the Midwest, again, different region of the country. I worked almost 9 years in Aurora, Colorado, which is a major suburb, a very large city, 350,000 people. So,
Marked by the theater shooting.
right, and so what I tell people is, from my experience in working in different regions of the country in different size departments, is policing from place to place is about 85% the same. It's about dealing with crime, dealing with traffic safety, making sure your organization runs efficiently and is responsive to the community. The 15% that's different community to community can be wildly different depending upon the uniqueness of that community. And Miami Beach is certainly an extraordinarily unique city.
The culture is set from the top. Is part of the culture that you found in this department, and maybe in other South Florida departments that have actually gone through some similar issues, is the culture at the top part of that 15% different?
Well, I could talk for hours about the 15% that's different, but within the context of why we're here, okay, I will tell you that my read of in my mind, there are 3 players in this event who made choices that had painful and even destructive consequences on the organization and left us where we are today, okay? There's the major, Angel Vasquez, and from everything I've seen and read about and heard about him, he was quite a force within the department and a very charismatic and somewhat domineering person, known within the organization as someone that you do not want to cross because he could be vindictive. This lieutenant, Carullo, who was a lieutenant at the time, so he's a mid-level manager, but has a lot of people working for him. If you look closely at some of his emails, you'll see that a lot of the people he emails to are subordinates, literally people who are working for him on the street. And then, of course, there's the issue of my predecessor and what he did or failed to do. So I really see those folks, and we're talking about the top of the organization, being largely responsible for creating a climate in which these emails could be sent around without consequence. I also see a lot of very, very good cops receiving these emails. And I tried to portray yesterday in the press conference in a culture in policing where at the very top this behavior is, I would say, more than tolerated. It was actually encouraged if you see that 80 of these emails are sent by the major and 140 of them are sent by the lieutenant. In a culture where this behavior was encouraged by these 2 senior leaders, very, very difficult for an officer to quote-unquote do something. And the conversation that's being had now, because this morning I played the entire press conference for about 40 officers this morning, and I'm going to do this over the course of the next week with every single employee. The impact on this organization of their choices and their behavior at the top is just extraordinarily painful. Because we have wonderful people here doing great police work. I'm proud to be the police chief here and to be associated with all these wonderful people, and I'm feeling their anguish that once again they are being tarred by the behavior of a handful of people, and to have it be people who are at the top of the organization it's exasperating and frustrating, and it really, really makes me angry. I'm extremely angry at the people I've talked to you about.
That is absolutely the part of, a couple of bad apples contained a whole department is absolutely part of the story. And this department has had, I don't want to take the time to go through them, but you had officers picking up bachelorettes on their ATVs, and you had off-duty officers drunk,
right.
And so there's been this string of things that department has had to put up and face with. So to never allow those things to happen again, what have you done, and what policies have you put in place?
But you need to understand the frustration here. If you're a good cop, okay, and this organization is loaded with good cops, like any organization, 99%, and you see on TV the Miami Beach Police Department is portrayed by these events in the past and these handful of individuals, you just get so frustrated and angry that the community doesn't know I'm a good cop, and today I arrested 2 robbers. And yesterday, I did these wonderful things for a family that was in distress. They don't see that. They see, even last night's, I watched the clips last night, and a very, very complex subject is reduced to a 3-minute television program, and it's just frustrating.
And the nature of what we do. Not that I'm going to apologize.
I get it, right. I get
the
it.
dynamic
But
of
but
what we
but
do, right.
but there's this. So for instance, we go back to July 3rd of 2011. This organization underwent a sea change around accountability after that. That's 4 years ago.
Yeah.
But still, the media brings up the July 3rd ATV incident all the time when it talks about the Miami Beach Police Department. They instituted a whole host of accountability reforms around supervision on the street and all those kinds of things. That stuff doesn't get reported. These cops know it. They feel it. The organization is a much better organization for what happened 4 years ago and how we learned from it. But when a new perceived scandal shows up, what happens? The old ones are also, it's a tough time here. I just want everybody to know I got great cops, and they're doing a great job every single day. This event is terrible. I largely blame the people we've talked about, and to the extent we need to have some introspection and conversation about what we're going to do different going forward to avoid this ever happening again, that is underway.
The public sees varying degrees of consequence and wonders how are officers and supervisors held to the standard by which they're expected.
Okay. So do you want me to address each of those? So for instance, with regard to the major, when I found out about this information, at the time that I asked him to relieve immediately, I thought this was about pornography. We didn't realize until we searched those 1 million emails, we didn't realize until roughly December the additional behavior he engaged in with regard to racist emails and, of course, the, I believe, criminal behavior of releasing the autopsy photo. Had I known about that in July, when the most important thing on my mind was to get him out of the agency, I would have handled it differently. I would have demoted him and moved forward with the criminal and internal affairs investigation. But last July, I thought what I had was a pornography case against him, and I wanted him out of the agency immediately. And he gracefully agreed to just leave. So that I hope that explains that. Now that's the kind of nuance that I'm not sure gets through in all the reporting on event. The short answer to the Archer matter is that there were very significant mitigating factors that explain why I felt, and I'm very comfortable with the decision to give him the most significant suspension or penalty short of termination. Very, very quickly, they included his record within the organization, exceptional record within the organization, no prior findings of discipline, the fact that the organization failed him at 2 critical moments in that, the fact that he was subjected to racial slurs by that woman, the fact that he was left alone to struggle with these 2 people on the street, that there was no finding that the actions that he took on the street violated any policy or law, that were down to the one strike in the parking lot, which is instinctive and immediate, in the garage. I don't know if you know, but if you watch that video, the kick, if you slow down the video of that kick, the kick does not strike her. The sergeant is pulling her away, and the kick actually lands on the sergeant's thigh. So there's a whole series of mitigating factors, and one of my obligations is to make sure that my discipline is reasonable and fair. I'm also convinced that had I fired him, that would not have been sustained in arbitration. One of the things I have to consider is what's reasonable and sustainable in a subsequent employee challenge in arbitration. So I believe I arrived at the correct decision in that case.
Our thanks to the chief for his time and his candor, and you can see that interview in its entirety on our website. It is now linked on local10.com.
Up next, we are taking it all to the round table, and we hope you can weigh in as well. Here is a part of the show that we certainly love, and we think you do too. We take a critical and analytical look at the week's top stories with our Powerhouse Roundtable.
And let us introduce them now. Katie Sorensen is a former Miami-Dade commissioner and now runs the Good Government Initiative at the University of Miami. Bill Diggs is president of the Mourning Family Foundation, and before that he was the chief executive officer of the Miami-Dade Chamber of Commerce. Mark Caputo, the Florida correspondent for Politico, and he writes a must-read daily roundup with emphasis lately on the state legislature. Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Welcome for the first time, Mr. Diggs.
Yeah, great to have you here, Bill.
Thank you so much.
But Mark, I want to begin with you to give us sort of bring us up to date. Where do the House and Senate leadership stand on The special session of the legislature is supposed to begin June 1st. They do have an agenda. It's kind of a narrow agenda they've agreed to. What is it?
Basically, they've agreed to do their jobs finally. That is to pass a budget. They were supposed to do that in the legislative session. They failed to do it because of a disagreement essentially over whether to expand Medicaid or not. Now they basically come up with an agreement. Hey, we're going to put Medicaid expansion up for a vote, so the Senate will pass it, the House will kill it,
and then
they'll move on,
and then
they'll
what?
pass the budget, and life will continue.
Yeah.
What is a continuation
Right, that was
budget?
the
The continuation budget is a fiction.
At the risk of sounding clueless, what does that even mean?
Well, the governor, let's point out, it is the governor who said, let's just pass a continuation budget.
Yeah.
But had anybody in the
Nobody had heard
state
of
of
it.
Florida ever heard?
Did he make
Except
that
that
up?
his chief of staff actually had that where she
In Louisiana.
where she came from.
Yeah.
So I guess he thought it was a real thing. But with all the growth in this state, a continuation of budget is essentially going backwards because you have more students in public schools, more prisoners in prison, more cars on the roads, and so if you're going to stay still, you're going backwards.
Yeah.
Well, the alternative was have no budget, and then you actually have to come up with a plan for how to shut the lights off in Florida government. So Rick Scott was in a position where he didn't have a lot of political juice, doesn't have a lot of political juice. Yeah, the House and Senate were warring tribes, and so he was damned if he did or damned if he didn't. That is, how to get involved.
warring Republican tribes,
Right.
as a matter of fact. Bill, when you take a look at the legislature from your point of view, what do you think?
Well, you know, for me, I was really surprised to hear him even speak about a continuation budget because nowhere in the Constitution does it even allow for such provision. So,
Right.
you know, I think it was just an early speak for him saying, listen, we know we've got a lot of work to do. And I'm confident that they now are going to get back to doing the work. And because at least, you know, from the perspective of most of the citizens in the state, we all know that there are many, many different issues that are affecting us, and we've got to find an answer to all of them. So, you know, they can't stand still, not now.
But you know, and now off the table is something that was really front and center. The governor wanted tax cut, tax cut. We got press releases every day about the tax cuts. Education spending was supposed to be at historic levels.
Yeah.
You don't hear anything. That's dead in the water, right?
Well, it's pretty much dead in the water. This is what happens when you encounter a major problem where the House and the Senate are not going to agree. It's Mike Tyson said it best, like everyone's got a plan and then they get punched in the mouth. And so that's basically what
But
happens.
you know what's really amazing is we're going to have online voter registration. We're into the 21st century, and the governor actually approved it. I thought that was amazing.
And that might be a slow motion disaster, though.
I was just going to say, any concerns about that at all?
Well, the governor did, and the weird thing about Rick Scott signing the bill is his own Secretary of State, who's in charge of elections, was like, look, let's not do this.
Yeah.
And behind the scenes, he was telling legislators, we don't have the infrastructure and capacity to do this properly without ensuring there's no fraud.
But there are more
They
than
have to get
there
that,
are
though.
more than 20 states in our country where they have online voter registration. They seem to make it work. I mean,
Yep,
why can't we make it work?
because this is Florida.
Okay, excuse me.
That wasn't scripted either.
All right, I want to move on, if we can, to a really interesting week in the presidential sweepstakes for the Republican candidates. And Marco Rubio, I thought, had a very good week with his speech to the Council on Foreign Relations. And Mark, I thought, let's just say the obvious, Jeb Bush had the worst week of his
No good, very bad week.
coming candidacy. I mean,
I'd say that's true. I would imagine that Jeb Bush would probably agree with you if you had an opportunity to ask him. Yeah, it was a four-day slow-motion disaster.
Right.
He's asked one day, essentially it airs on Monday, would you support the war in Iraq, knowing what you know now? He says yes. Then the next day he's like, I misheard the question, but it's hypothetical. Then the next day he's like, it's hypothetical and we'll do a disservice to the soldiers. And then finally, day 4, he says,
Can
oh
I
yeah,
just say,
I would have done
if
it.
you watch that interview with Megyn Kelly on Fox, and this is just watch it, objectively speaking, he did misunderstand the question, and the way he framed the answer, I thought was very clear that he was answering, what would you have done then?
Still, after you slip up and you have to clean up your mess, don't make it messier. And that's what he did.
And- well,
Right, but
if
he's
I
going to
can,
have a persistent problem with this family loyalty issue and being his own man, and it's going to persist. It's not going to go away.
Well, I mean, but the two are going to have to find a way to peacefully coexist. I mean, I think what I'm shocked about is the fact that he just seems to be really behind the mark in regards to where he's supposed to be as a person who is going to be running for president. I mean, I'm actually shocked because even the conversation that he had with the young lady in college, you know, when she asked him a very nice question and he said, wow, pedantic. You know, I mean, it was almost like he was being disingenuous with her. I'm thinking, you can't miss on this part. I mean, if you can't get your politics straight, at least you got to figure out how to be a nice guy somewhere down the line.
You know, you bring up a really good point, because the wow, pedantic, that is sort of the personality we see usually. I thought what was much more jarring this week is that there was no my way or the highway. He was waffling.
He's like, where's the highway?
That's what was so jarring, is that,
He's really rusty.
Well,
Yeah, Mark and I
Done
were
this in a
talking
while.
about that earlier, about how rusty he is, as a matter of fact. But I'm really shocked at this because, well, I think that what you're going to find, in my opinion, is that he's going to probably have to bring out, his ace of spades a lot earlier, who's probably going to be Columbus. She's got to find a way to kind of get to the center and help him to kind of become the Jeb that we're all going to like, because unless he gets there, forget about whether he's got his politics straight. He's just not going to be seen as a nice guy.
Yeah, but Columba Bush, who is a very nice lady, has historically been reluctant to step forward and do anything
She doesn't like the
in
limelight.
public. I mean,
Well,
she
they-
doesn't really like politics
They
very much.
unveiled a Twitter and Instagram account for her, coincidentally, on Friday. Did you just
Really?
that? Yes.
Wow.
It was in Politico.
breaking news,
Right,
right?
Mark wrote about it, I think, as a matter of fact. Yeah.
All right, well, hold your thoughts. We're going to come back, talk about maybe Marco Rubio's week. Much better. So we'll be back with more Roundtable in a minute. Welcome back on this Sunday morning, live in our studio, our Powerhouse Roundtable. And let's kind of wrap up, if we can, the Jeb Bush discussion here about his awful week. I mean, here is a column from the New York Times the other day. Gail Collins normally writes with a very light touch, but here is what, and she very smart touch. Here's what she, the headline says, "Wow, Jeb Bush is awful." And here's what she wrote. So far, he seems to be a terrible candidate. He couldn't keep his "I'm my own man" mantra going through the spring. He overbabbled at private gathering. He didn't even know how to answer the Iraq question, which should have been the first thing he tackled on the first day. You know, Mark, honestly, I think in a moment of candor, Jeb Bush would say, well, gee, you know, I'm kind of guilty of all that.
She might be right, but Gail Collins has not met a Republican presidential candidate she likes. I mean, this is a person who spent half of the 2012 election cycle talking about Romney's dog. So
Yeah,
let's remember
the
the
dog on the roof. That's
Do we even
correct.
talk about Romney in
dog
the
was on the
fight
roof,
today?
though. Yeah.
Is that on our list?
She's talking about something in my mind that was relevant
But
at
the
the
other
time.
thing about him is that he doesn't like to have coaching. He doesn't want to have handlers. He wants to just be his own official or his own authentic self. And
Right.
you know, you
Which
have to
works
have
for
a-
him in many ways.
Yeah, but you have to have a
Yeah.
you have to practice a little bit.
All right,
But
well,
the United States and Florida, though, I mean, he's got a big road to hoe with this one. He's going to have to find his way to listen to all these people that want to be his handlers in some
well, at
kind
least,
of way.
you know, and I'm not speaking as an advocate for Jeb Bush, but at least as opposed to Hillary Clinton, he is out there, and the 19-year-old college student in Reno who sort of challenged him on something, he didn't run away from her. Hillary Clinton is yet to answer any questions
Well, Hillary's
from...
not running away because she's nowhere near anyone to be able to run away. That's true. Everything with her is tightly scripted.
Yes.
And she doesn't need to yet.
Yeah.
This is true.
That's exactly right. She
Yeah.
doesn't need to yet,
Yeah.
and when she needs to, she will. She's definitely going to engage.
Although, I mean, in Politico, we've run a series of reports concerning, you know, the Clinton Foundation, the like, their relationship with the Moroccan government. It's there are people who would argue she certainly needs to answer questions, but yes, the
Right.
polling indicates she doesn't.
Well, the fact is, I think that the fact that she doesn't answer reporters' questions doesn't bother most people because they hold
They hate us.
They hate us. I mean, most people despise the media, and so if it's a reporter who's being ignored, most people will say, yeah, ignore that person. I almost used another word, but
Marco,
It's a 7-second delay.
Marco Rubio this week had a good week.
boy, did he ever. I thought his speech to the Council on Foreign Relations was done with skill. And it was kind of here's a latter-day version of John McCain, a very muscular, aggressive kind of stance on foreign policy. And he talked about, Katie, he talked about his 3 pillars: American strength, protecting American business interests in a global economy, and moral clarity. on, you know, when we
yes,
deal with the
and,
world.
And I think that we can all espouse those values, but it was much more of a mission statement, and he was proposing it as a doctrine. Paul Beinart in The Atlantic wrote a piece about that, which I thought was really interesting, that doctrines are really specific things about specific situations.
Like the Monroe Doctrine was
the
specific.
Monroe
yes.
Doctrine, the Truman Doctrine of containment, the Reagan Doctrine, the Iran-Contra ended up being a doctrine, I guess, and the Bush Doctrine, preventive wars, and all of that. So those are very specific situations. His doctrine's more platitudes. So he did show gravitas. He came across as very smart and thoughtful. But you know, if you really dissect it, I don't know how much doctrine is there.
He's a great speaker. He is a good speaker. That's his thing. But, you know, he had a moment this week on Wednesday, responding to all the Jeb Bush controversy. On Wednesday, he said that he would have authorized the war in Iraq, and then, you know, he had said on Fox News he didn't think it was a mistake, and then on Wednesday he seemed to backtrack. You know, he had his own little muddied water.
And of
there.
course he's claiming he didn't. That is, he can hold both opinions at the same
So, yeah,
time.
that's fair. That's fair.
Yeah. All right, Bill Diggs, let me get your take. You heard earlier Dan Oates, the Miami Beach police chief, talking about these emails, these somewhat, deeply offensive emails that were exchanged between some high-ranking cops and then some beat cops. I mean, we had something this awful happen a couple of weeks ago in Fort Lauderdale. When you see this, it's just really awful. I mean, it's offensive.
Yeah, it's hurtful, and I think that, you know, it really does, in my mind, talk about how much work we have to do as a community and as a country. You know, the problem with the social media and the sound bites that you're getting now, I think that what's beginning to happen is that white America is seeing what we as black people have been living with for hundreds of years. It's just now coming to the point that it's really becoming evident again. It's almost like the picture that of King and the dogs and people being bitten. And when, you know, America saw that, they were like, oh my God, the shame of it all. Yeah. And we're like, we've been getting bit for a long time.
And now America's seen it because everybody has a cell phone camera. And social media, these images are spread around the world.
And when body cameras on police become more prevalent, we're going to see a lot more, and it'll put everybody on better behavior.
Yeah, that's going to be the last word, Katie. Thank you for coming in, Bill Diggs.
Thanks so much.
Come back again, and Mark Caputo, keep writing that daily roundup. I love it every day on Politico.
Keep reading.
Okay.
When we come back, the death of Steven Sotloff brought the horror of ISIS terrorism right home to South Florida, and now his legacy lives in a special painting, and we will see that next.
Steven Sotloff was a fine reporter from South Florida who was drawn to the Middle East, and it is there that he was murdered last year by ISIS terrorists. Now, his memory is being honored here by a special art show in Fort Lauderdale.
The centerpiece of the show is a special piece of art dedicated to Steven's memory. Local 10 News reporter Carlos Suarez was there.
A vibrant and symbolic piece of art, the memorial makes no mention of Steven Sotloff's death. The only hint of Mideast conflict is the Dome of the Rock in the old city where Sotloff once lived. The fruits of righteousness give way to orchids and greenery where you'll find Sotloff's own words, the letters he secretly wrote to his family while he was held hostage by the terror group ISIS.
It's kind of a blueprint of what he wants us to do, how to live our lives.
Arthur and Shirley Sotloff got a look at the painting by artist Tracy Ellen for the first time on Tuesday. It's on display at the Greenspoon Martyr Law Firm in Fort Lauderdale as part of its community arts partnership. Ellen said she began working on the piece after Sotloff's death as a way to give back to the family who she said lost so much.
There's a lightness, there's a soulfulness about it that she really loved.
The artwork was picked by the family after it was submitted to the Steven Sotloff Two Lives Foundation, which helps support journalists and their families.
I love color, and it was different, and it had nothing to do with how Steven died. It just had to do with just something that illuminated in Tracy's mind.
Sotloff's father said he could see his son in the painting, the embodiment of his life, his faith, and the quest he was on to bring a little more light into the world.
I kind of felt like my son was standing in front of me. You know, it was a part of him. He was an extraordinary person.
The artwork will remain on display at the law firm for now. It was unveiled a day after Sotloff would have turned 32 years old. Reporting in the newsroom, I'm Carlos Suarez for This Week in South Florida.
Our thanks to Carlos and to the Sotloffs.
All right, still to come, my personal perspective about the impasse over Medicaid expansion and what the governor is doing or not doing about it to fix it. A live look now, kind of a cloudy day out there right now, it appears, from the Miami Tower Cam.
Let's check in with Weather Authority meteorologist Jennifer Correa with the rest of the Sunday forecast. Hi, Jennifer.
Hey, Glenna. Hi, Michael. Well, it does look very cloudy over Miami Beach and into Miami as well. But take a look at this. At Fort Lauderdale, the skies have opened up. We did have a few passing showers out there. Some of them were heavy. And even in Key West, you haven't seen any rain. Just lots of sunshine, a couple of clouds mixing in, but still mostly cloudy in Miami. No rain falling in Miami as temperatures are warming up into the low 80s, upper 80s for Key West. Here's a look at the radar. So spotty showers, heavy downpours, though, impacting Miramar and Pembroke Pines, and then a couple of showers down into North Miami and Miami Shores. But as far as more rainfall this afternoon, it's actually pushing to the west. So we're still keeping the 30% chance because of those passing showers. We'll see some drier conditions through the afternoon. Michael?
Jennifer, thanks. All right, before we leave you this morning, a personal perspective about the upcoming special session of the Florida legislature. Lawmakers will reconvene in Tallahassee in about 2 weeks. There's only one thing they've got to do up there: pass a budget. They couldn't do that during their regular session because of weak-kneed leadership in the House, a refusal to compromise in the state Senate, and a failure of leadership by the governor. They all parted ways on whether or how to expand Medicaid. The governor just despises Medicaid. He says it is a failed health care program. Well, certainly it's not perfect, but it's better than nothing, and nothing is what 800,000 Floridians have when it comes to health insurance. So you've got to ask, how would the governor get those 800,000 Floridians, the working poor for the most part, how would he get them to see a doctor for preventive care and regular checkups rather than showing up in the emergency room? The governor simply has not answered that question. Rick Scott says what is needed from the lawmakers is a continuation budget, a stay-even budget, about the same amount of money to run the state as in this fiscal year, even though the state has $1 billion more in revenue. And there will be 15,000 more kids enrolling in school, more inmates in our state prisons, more cars on our highways. You get the idea. This is not the time for stay even. It's a time to move forward, thankfully. Most lawmakers agree. I think they are going to come up with a reasonable budget by June 20th with money to help the poor to get basic health insurance and some money for safety net hospitals. The governor clearly doesn't like those safety net hospitals. He wants for-profit hospitals to bail them out financially. Not going to happen, as President Bush 41 used to say. And isn't it ironic that this proposal to pool hospital profits is coming from a guy who got rich running the nation's largest for-profit hospital chain? Bottom line here, the governor needs to get out of the legislature's way. He is stuck in an ideological rut. There are wiser, cooler, and yes, smarter heads in the State House and Senate who will solve the budget crisis. State government is not going to shut down July 1st, and Rick Scott's warnings that it might, well, that is just the governor crying wolf to get his way. But this time, he won't. That's my perspective for the week. I hope you have a wonderful Sunday. Remember, as always, stay informed, get involved.
Michael Putney and Fuego today. What do you think? We invite you to weigh in on any topic you like in the news. Here are the addresses you can find us. Email is good, Facebook, Twitter, we love, and at any of these addresses, we are very easy to find.
And we love hearing from you.
Yes, have a beautiful Sunday. We'll see you next week.